I've always taken anniversaries way too seriously. At least that's what he used to tease me about in the early years. Back then, he said it was cute how I'd plan everything down to the candles and the playlist, like our marriage was some sacred holiday. I believed him when he said those nights were his favorite, that they reminded him why he'd chosen me. It's funny, looking back now, how easily those words came out of his mouth, like he'd rehearsed them in another life. This year, I woke up already smiling, already replaying memories of cheesy restaurant photos and cheap wine that tasted perfect to us. I told myself this anniversary would be a reset button, that if I tried hard enough, maybe we'd find our way back. The morning started ordinary, that's the worst part, because ordinary can hide so much. He kissed my forehead in that distracted way he'd picked up lately, half present, half already gone. He said there was a big deadline at work, that his boss was breathing down his neck and he didn't want to lose this project. He promised he'd try to make it home early, said I shouldn't go overboard with dinner, like I always did. I laughed it off, but my stomach tightened, because somewhere between his explanation and that forced smile, something didn't add up. You know that cold little voice we all try to ignore, the one that whispers, "You already know the truth?" I tried to drown that voice in errands and routines, chopping vegetables, marinating the chicken he once said only I knew how to season right. I set the table anyway, folded the napkins the way he liked, because I still wanted to believe he'd walk through the door and be amazed. But as the afternoon dragged on, the silence in the house got heavy, like even the walls were holding their breath. A friend had told me, just a few weeks before, that he seemed distant, that he sounded different whenever he talked about staying late. At the time, I defended him, said he was just stressed, said marriage goes through phases and I needed to be more understanding. Standing there in my kitchen, looking at our anniversary dinner half prepped, I finally stopped defending him and grabbed my car keys. The sky outside looked deceptively peaceful, that soft late afternoon glow that usually calms me down. But not that day. That day it felt like the world was mocking me with its quiet beauty. I kept telling myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that driving toward his office wasn't spying, just confirming. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and every red light felt like a test I wasn't prepared for. I replayed his words from the morning, the way he said, "I'll make it up to you this weekend." Like our actual anniversary didn't matter. Somewhere between my street and the freeway, I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. By the time I reached the building where he worked, my heartbeat was in my ears. His parking spot, always the same one, always easy to spot, was empty, completely empty. I circled the lot twice, pretending maybe I'd missed it, but the truth sat in my throat like a stone. I parked across the street and just stared at that empty rectangle of asphalt, as if staring long enough would make his car appear. All the little inconsistencies from the past months came rushing back, the late-night showers, the sudden gym obsession, the secretive texting. I whispered, "Please don't let this be happening," even though I already knew it was. I drove slowly through the surrounding blocks, scanning sidewalks, restaurants, anywhere he might be avoiding me. Every car identical to his made my heart jolt. Every couple walking made my stomach tighten. I felt ridiculous, desperate, almost childish, but I couldn't stop. Something inside me needed the truth more than I needed my dignity. When I finally spotted his car, neatly parked outside that upscale restaurant we used to love, I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I wanted to turn around, drive home, pretend I never saw it, but something kept me rooted to the seat. I remember leaning forward, squinting through the windshield like the glass itself was lying to me. The restaurant's warm lights flickered against the windows, casting silhouettes that felt almost theatrical. And there, right near the middle table, was his profile, unmistakable, the way he tilted his head when he was trying to charm someone. He wasn't wearing the tired expression he'd given me that morning. No, he looked alive, energized, almost youthful. Across from him sat a woman I'd never seen before, her hair styled deliberately, her smile too familiar for comfort. When she reached across the table and touched his hand, my whole body reacted before my mind could catch up. It felt like something inside me cracked so loudly I swore the people passing by could hear it. My throat tightened, and my ears started ringing, that kind of high-pitched hum you get when your world suddenly shifts. I pressed my palm against my chest, like I could physically hold my heart together if I tried hard enough. He laughed at something she said, that soft laugh he once reserved only for me, and I felt nausea rise like a wave. For a second, I thought I'd open the car door and storm inside, flip the table, demand answers I wasn't ready to hear. But instead, I froze, the shock too sharp for movement, like grief had pinned me to the seat. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for my phone, the screen blurry from the tears I refused to let fall. I snapped a few photos from the safety of my hiding spot, the shutter sound feeling like betrayal in itself. Each picture felt like a nail sealing a truth I wished with every part of me wasn't real. I sat there longer than I should have, breathing through the ache, letting the rawness settle into something colder. Eventually, I turned the key in the ignition, forcing myself to drive away before I did something I couldn't take back. And as I headed home to the dinner I'd prepared for a man who wasn't mine anymore, a strange clarity began to settle in my bones. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my whole body felt like it had been wrung out. The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it, quiet, warm, waiting, but I felt like a stranger stepping into someone else's life. The table was still set for our anniversary dinner, candles unlit, plates placed perfectly across from each other. I stood there staring at the scene I'd created with so much hope, and something inside me twisted, almost violently. It was surreal, knowing he was across the city holding another woman's hand while I'd been here slicing vegetables with love. I leaned against the counter for a moment, letting the truth wash over me until my legs felt steady again. I kept pacing through the house like I was looking for something, maybe courage, maybe acceptance, maybe just air. Every corner of that place held a memory. Our first fight, our first Christmas, the plant he gave me that I somehow kept alive for years. And now it all felt contaminated, touched by the shadow of the woman who had no idea I existed, or worse, knew and didn't care. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the ease with which he'd walked into that restaurant. Like our anniversary didn't matter, like I didn't matter, like our entire history could be brushed aside for a night of excitement. I kept hearing his laugh play over and over in my head, that soft, intimate tone he once saved for moments between us. I checked the time, doing the math automatically, realizing they were probably ordering dessert by then. God, that stung. I tried to imagine what excuse he'd give me later, what story he'd craft to wrap the evening in a neat lie. He'd say the project took longer, that his phone died, that he didn't want to stress me out. He always had those ready-made lines that sounded so reasonable until you looked beneath the surface. I sat on the couch, staring at the door like I could will it open, like I could force him to walk in with the truth instead of another script. And as I waited, a slow, unmistakable shift happened inside me. Pain turning into something sharper, something frighteningly calm. The minutes crawled, each one feeling heavier than the last, like time itself was trying to suffocate me. I kept glancing at my phone, not because I expected him to call, but because some part of me wanted proof of his silence. Isn't it strange how silence can scream louder than any argument? Every vibration that wasn't from him made my chest tighten, a cruel reminder of where his attention really was. I imagined him leaning closer to her, maybe whispering something charming, something he hadn't said to me in months. The more the images played in my mind, the colder my hands felt, like my body was preparing for a blow it already took. Eventually, I couldn't sit anymore. Stillness felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready to give him that. I wandered into our bedroom, the same room where he used to pull me close and promise we were unbreakable. Now the bed looked too big, too neat, too untouched, like a museum piece of a life I no longer recognized. I sat at the edge, feeling the mattress dip under my weight, and that simple movement nearly unraveled me. How many nights had I waited for him there, believing the late nights were temporary, believing our love was stronger than exhaustion? My reflection in the mirror caught my eye, red, tired, older than I felt, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. I pressed my palms to my temples, trying to breathe through the ache, when a thought hit me so hard it made me sit up. He wasn't just betraying me, he was betraying the version of me that defended him, protected him, made excuses for him. And that hurt more than the affair itself. Because I'd built him a pedestal out of trust, and he'd climbed off it the second it no longer served him. I stood up, pacing again, thinking about the woman at the restaurant, wondering who she was, wondering if she knew she was sharing a man who wore a wedding ring. The jealousy was sharp, but beneath it was something steadier, something that felt dangerously like resolve. At some point, I found myself gripping the edge of the dresser, grounding myself against the swirl of questions flooding my mind. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Did he whisper to her the same reassurances he'd given me that morning? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't scared of the answers anymore. I was scared of what the truth was turning me into. My heartbreak wasn't soft or delicate. It was jagged, scraping through every memory we'd built together. Every late night he'd blamed on deadlines. Every weekend he said he needed to rest. Every time he'd brushed off my worry. It all sharpened into clarity. And clarity, as I learned that evening, can be the most terrifying form of strength. I walked slowly back to the kitchen, passing the set table like a ghost drifting through her former life. The candles I'd planned to light flickered in my peripheral vision, unlit and mocking, like they'd been waiting for a celebration that never stood a chance. I picked one up, rolling it between my hands, feeling its cold smoothness, thinking about how easily things can melt when heat is applied. Maybe that's what betrayal really is, the sudden flame that exposes what was already cracking beneath the surface. I set the candle down and opened a drawer, pulling out a small notebook where I kept random thoughts, recipes, reminders of the life I was trying to maintain. For the first time in years, I wrote something fueled not by hope, but by truth. He wasn't at work. The room felt different after those words hit the page, heavier yet strangely empowering. I wrote another line. I saw him with her. And my hand stopped shaking. Then another. This ends tonight. And everything inside me shifted from despair to determination. I didn't know what tonight would look like. Not exactly, but I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. And the woman who walked into that restaurant parking lot believing in second chances, she didn't exist anymore. I closed the notebook gently, like sealing the first clue of a story that was only beginning to unravel. By the time his car finally pulled into the driveway, the house felt like it was holding its breath along with me. I sat on the couch, arms wrapped around myself, listening to the familiar clink of his keys hitting the bowl by the door. He walked in with that exhausted sigh he always used, the one meant to convince me he was drowning in work. Then he glanced at the table, the dinner I'd prepared, the effort I'd put in, and instead of guilt, I saw annoyance flash across his face. Like my disappointment was somehow an inconvenience to him, like he expected praise for showing up hours late on our anniversary. Long day, he said, rubbing his temples, as if those words alone were supposed to erase everything I'd witnessed. He didn't look at me for more than a second before heading toward the kitchen, his act almost insultingly rehearsed. He opened the fridge, grabbed water, leaned against the counter like he owned the place and the truth. When he finally spoke again, he said he was sorry. He couldn't make it home earlier, that his boss had kept him hostage in the office. The word hostage nearly made me laugh. A hollow, dangerous laugh I swallowed quickly. I watched him lie so effortlessly, shifting his weight, avoiding eye contact, acting like he deserved sympathy for abandoning me. If I didn't know better, I might have believed him, but I knew exactly where he'd been and who he'd been with. He took a sip of water and glanced at the unlit candles, lifting a brow like he was the victim of unreasonable expectations. Did you go all out again? He asked, using that tone people use with children who don't know better. Something inside me snapped, but I kept my face as still as marble. I asked how his project meeting went, watching the way his jaw tightened just slightly at the word meeting. He launched into a story, a ridiculous, detailed, overly polished version of a night that never existed. And with every lie that left his lips, my resolve knit itself tighter, like armor forming in real time. He kept talking, weaving excuses like he'd been practicing them on his drive home. He said the team was under immense pressure, that his boss would have killed him if he'd left earlier. He even added a dramatic sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was the one who'd been wronged tonight. I nodded slowly, studying his face, noticing every flicker of discomfort whenever my gaze lingered too long. He asked why I was so quiet, said it made him nervous when I stared at him like that. In his mind, silence was more threatening than the betrayal he thought he'd buried under lies. So I asked him if he'd eaten. That question, just 5 harmless words, made him shift, eyes darting just a bit too fast. He said he hadn't had time, that work had swallowed him whole, that he was starving. And that answer, that stupid careless lie about hunger, felt like the final confirmation carved in stone. Because I had watched him eat, I had seen the dessert menu on the table, the wine glasses, the easy laughter. I knew his tells, the way he scratched the side of his neck, the way he blinked too slowly when fabricating a story. I stood up and walked toward the table, lighting the candles one by one, letting the flames illuminate the cracks between us. He watched me with suspicion, like he sensed something was shifting but couldn't name it yet. He said I was acting strange, that I was ruining the night, even though he'd been the one who abandoned it. He asked if we could just enjoy dinner without turning everything into drama, as if the betrayal was mine to explain. There was a moment when he reached for my hand, lightly, like a peace offering he didn't deserve. I pulled my hand away before his fingers touched mine, and the small rejection made his expression sharpen into irritation. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, giving me that look, the one that said I was being unreasonable again. He said I always imagined the worst, that I had a talent for creating problems where there were none. Hearing him say that, on our anniversary of all days, felt like being slapped with the very lie he'd been living. So I repeated his story back to him, word for word, every detail he'd just fed me. He nodded confidently at first, proud of the narrative he'd built, until I asked what restaurant his boss took him to for this urgent meeting. His lips parted, but nothing came out. Not a word. He blinked, stalled, then scoffed, saying he didn't remember the name. He claimed it wasn't important, that I was getting worked up over nothing. But that nothing had a name, a location, and a woman wearing a red dress with her fingers wrapped around his hand. So I told him where he'd been, calmly, almost gently, like I was telling someone their shoelace was untied. I told him I'd gone to his office, that his car wasn't there, that I'd found it parked outside our favorite restaurant. His face drained of color so quickly I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then the panic set in. He stepped toward me, hands up, voice trembling with anger and fear tangled together. He said I'd been spying, that I was invading his privacy, that I was destroying our marriage with my paranoia. He actually tried to twist the betrayal back onto me, as if seeing the truth made me the villain. But his words no longer held power. They slid off me like water on stone. So I simply told him not to worry, that I would take care of everything. I barely slept that night, but not because of heartbreak. That part had already burned through me like wildfire. What kept me awake was a clarity I hadn't felt in years, a kind of cold, steady pulse that replaced every shaky breath. He stayed in the guest room, slamming the door like a teenager, muttering that I'd ruined the evening, as if I hadn't walked in on the ashes of our marriage. I lay on my side, staring at the dark, thinking about every warning sign I'd brushed aside, every lie I'd swallowed to keep the peace. Funny how peace becomes a cage when you're the only one trying to protect it. By sunrise, something inside me had shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just sharpened. I made coffee in silence, the familiar smell grounding me as I rehearsed what needed to be done. Not drama, not revenge driven by rage. No, something cleaner, smarter, colder. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook from the night before, flipping to the page where I'd written the truth. Underneath those first confessions, I added a new line. This isn't the end. This is the plan. And for the first time since seeing them together, I felt the smallest spark of control return to my hands. I started by gathering every breadcrumb he'd left trailing behind him for months. The credit card statements with unfamiliar charges, the late-night receipts he'd forgotten in his pockets, the subtle scent of perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his jackets. I even checked our phone bill, tracing the repeated calls to a number he never bothered saving under a fake name. Each proof felt like a puzzle piece snapping perfectly into place, forming a picture even he wouldn't be able to twist. And with every piece I collected, my fear loosened its grip, making space for something frighteningly empowering. By mid-morning, I knew exactly what my next step had to be, and who I needed to call. I called a friend who'd been through a brutal divorce years ago, the kind that strips you bare and forces you to rebuild from the ashes. When she picked up, she didn't ask if I was okay. She asked, "What did he do?" Just hearing those words broke something tight inside my chest, because finally, someone saw through the facade I'd been fighting to hold together. I told her everything, the restaurant, the woman, the lies he'd spun without blinking. She didn't comfort me with cliches or gentle reassurances. Instead, she gave me the name of an attorney who didn't lose cases like mine. A woman known for cutting through men like him with the precision of a surgeon. I sat in my car for a long moment before dialing the attorney's office, my thumb hovering over the call button. This wasn't the life I'd imagined, calling a lawyer on the morning after my anniversary. But the moment the receptionist picked up and asked how they could help, I felt a strange sense of relief. Within hours, I was sitting across from a woman in a navy suit, her eyes sharp, her voice calm, her questions cutting right to the truth. I handed her the photos, the receipts, the timeline, each piece a small confession of the marriage I'd been trying to save alone. She studied everything carefully, then leaned back and said the words I didn't realize I needed to hear. "You have the upper hand." She explained that infidelity, especially on a significant date like an anniversary, carried legal weight, that his financial records painted a clear picture of misconduct, that the house, the one I'd made a home, could be secured for me. Alimony was likely, asset division on my side, and options I didn't even know existed were suddenly laid before me like tools. For a moment, I felt dizzy, overwhelmed not by fear, but by possibility. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was strategy. When I left the attorney's office, the world felt different. Not softer, not kinder, but clearer. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and for the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't drowning. I sat in my car with the folder she'd given me resting on my lap, its weight strangely comforting, like a shield I hadn't known I needed. Inside were the beginnings of my new life, drafted paperwork, instructions, a checklist of what to gather next. I traced my finger over the edge of the folder, imagining his face when he realized I wasn't the naive woman he'd counted on. And that tiny spark of satisfaction warmed me more than the morning sun. Driving home, I rehearsed my plan over and over, each detail unfolding with precise intention. No screaming, no crying, no dramatic scenes. That would only satisfy him, make him feel powerful. No. I wanted him blindsided, cornered by the very lies he thought he'd buried. So instead of confronting him again, I played along, quiet and composed, giving him the illusion of normalcy. He mistook my calm for forgiveness, even relief, and the arrogance in his smile nearly made me laugh. Letting him believe he'd gotten away with it was the sweetest setup I could have imagined. I planned a dinner, a second chance anniversary, as I called it, using the exact tone he always used when he wanted something. I told him I wanted to talk, to reconnect, to rebuild what we'd lost. The way his shoulders relaxed was almost pathetic. He didn't even hide how relieved he was. He said he was glad I was being reasonable, glad we could move past the misunderstanding. And I smiled, nodding gently, hiding the truth that the only thing we were moving past was him. Because the next dinner we shared would be his last as my husband, and he would never see it coming. The night of the second chance anniversary dinner arrived far too quickly, but I felt strangely steady, almost serene. I cooked his favorite meal, not because I wanted to please him, but because I wanted the contrast to sting. The house smelled warm and inviting, the table set beautifully, candles flickering like witnesses about to testify. I wore a calm face, a soft smile, the version of me he believed would always come back no matter how deeply he cut. When he walked through the door, he hesitated, surprised by the softness of the scene I'd created. He even smiled, that smug little smile men wear when they think everything is back under their control. He walked over and kissed my cheek lightly, testing the waters, as if gauging whether I'd fully surrendered. He said he was glad we were trying again, that couples go through rough patches, that communication was key. It was almost laughable, the way he packaged betrayal into something manageable, something shallow, something we could move past. I nodded, asked him to sit, watched as he loosened his shoulders, fully convinced he'd charmed his way back into safety. He reached for the wine I'd set on the table, pouring confidently, even toasting to new beginnings. And with every bit of false sentiment that left his mouth, the folder under the napkins felt heavier, more inevitable. We ate, or at least he did. I mostly pushed my food around the plate, preparing myself for the moment everything shifted. He talked about work, about some project he might lead, about the future he pictured for us now that the misunderstanding was behind us. He actually said that, misunderstanding, reducing my broken heart to a scheduling conflict. I let him talk, let him dig himself deeper with every careless sentence. He reached across the table once, trying to take my hand, and I had to remind myself not to recoil too quickly. He was so comfortable, so sure of his power, that he didn't even notice the storm drifting steadily toward him. When he finally paused to take a sip of wine, I reached beneath the neatly folded napkin and pulled out the folder. For a split second, he didn't notice. He was too busy rambling about some imaginary weekend getaway he thought would reset us. Then his eyes dropped to the table, and I watched confusion bloom across his face, slow and clumsy, like his brain couldn't keep up. He asked what it was, his voice light but strained, the way people talk when they already sense something is very, very wrong. I slid it toward him without a word, resting my hands in my lap, steady, composed, almost eerily calm. He opened it, expecting maybe a love letter, maybe an apology, anything but the truth he'd been running from. The moment he saw the first photo, the one of him leaning in toward her, hand under the table, his mouth fell open. He didn't speak, he just stared, eyes flicking frantically between the pages, as if the order of the evidence might change the meaning. Next came the credit card statements, the phone records, the timestamps from the night he'd sworn he was held hostage at work. His fingers trembled, and for the first time in a long time, I watched him stripped of his arrogance, exposed down to the bone. He whispered my name, soft and panicked, like saying it gently could unbreak what he'd shattered. I didn't answer. I just waited, letting the weight of reality settle onto him like concrete. When he finally looked up, desperation clung to his expression. He said I'd misunderstood, that it wasn't what it looked like, that I'd taken everything out of context. And I swear, hearing those lines, the same recycled excuses men have used since the beginning of time, almost made me laugh. I leaned back in my chair, watching him unravel, watching his world tilt the way mine had in that parking lot. He said I was overreacting, that we could fix this, that he was willing to try if I was willing to forgive. His voice cracked on the word forgive, like he was choking on the very idea of losing the life he'd taken for granted. He reached across the table, desperate now, fingertips shaking as he tried to close the folder like shutting it could erase everything inside. He told me not to make any rash decisions, said we shouldn't throw away years of marriage over one mistake. One mistake? As if betrayal on our anniversary, in a restaurant we once claimed as ours, was a misplaced sock or a forgotten chore. I felt a stillness settle over me then, a kind of quiet strength I didn't recognize at first because it wasn't born of love. It was born of finally choosing myself. I told him I wasn't throwing anything away, that he had done that the moment he sat across from another woman and called it normal. His eyes widened, panic replacing indignation, and he begged me to reconsider, his voice cracking on each plea like truth was tightening its grip. He stood up suddenly, pacing behind his chair, running his hands through his hair like someone searching for an exit in a locked room. He said his life would fall apart, that he'd lose everything, that I couldn't do this to him, not after everything he'd worked for. He didn't mention what I'd worked for, what I'd built, what I'd sacrificed. Men like him rarely do. I simply folded my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and told him the papers were already in motion. That all he had to do was sign when the time came, and stay out of my way. When I stood, he reached for my arm, soft at first, then more desperate, as if holding me physically could keep the truth from moving forward. But I stepped back, out of reach, out of his orbit, out of the life he'd taken for granted. His face crumpled when he realized he couldn't touch me anymore. Not my body, not my loyalty, not my silence. I told him dinner was over, the marriage was over, and the version of me who would have forgiven him died the moment I saw him laughing with her. Then I walked out of the dining room, leaving him alone with the evidence of his own undoing. And behind me, the candles flickered softly, like they were finally lighting the truth instead of the lie.